It turns out stances work a little differently from most other systems. Namely, you don't need to register them like you need to with the cards, relics, and orbs we've used so far. However, copying the code from the Calm stance didn't lead to the best results. The Discord channel for modding had several people asking about custom stances, with replies saying that they're easy to do. But no examples were given. In the end, I found a mod on the workshop, the Marked mod, which had a custom stance, and I referenced its source code on GitHub. From there, I did some experimenting to figure out the bare minimum for a stance. Our custom stances need to extend abstract stance, predictably, and only needs its constructor and override for update description, and a handful of variables. We will need our public static final string stance_ID, a private static final string stance string, a private static final string name, and a public static final string array descriptions. The stance_ID is made from our main class's makeID function. We get the stance string from cardcrawlgame.languagepack.getStanceString using the stance_ID. This means we'll need to load the strings in the main class's receiveEditStrings function using stancestrings.class as the type. The name and descriptions are then pulled from the loaded stance string. It was in the constructor that I screwed up. In the Wanderer and Change Stance action, some minor functionality of the base game stances is hard-coded in. There is fallback code in case the stance is not recognized, but I never initialized the reference variables for these, ID and name. These are both non-static member variables, and if we don't explicitly set these, then the variables will be null when passed into the Watcher and Change Stance action classes. So in the constructor, we need to set this, ID, to be equal to stance_ID, and this dot lowercase name to be equal to our static uppercase name. We then update the description and have a constructed stance. The update description function, for the sake of minimalism here, is just going to set this dot description to be the capital description's first member. Make sure to actually create a JSON file for the stance strings to work. For my stance, I decided to go with something staggering, or something that would leave the Watcher staggering. I'm pulling from the legacy of Jackie Chan and Mists of Pandaria with the drunk stance, where the Watcher embraces Zhui Quan, drunken boxing, though I've left it ambiguous as to whether or not alcohol is actually involved. My plan is, using Wrath as a template, to reduce incoming damage by 50%, but applying 33% as an unblockable damage over time effect called Stagger. The Stagger will be a power that triggers at the end of the player's turn, dealing 1/3 of its amount as damage, then reducing the stack by that amount. The good news, the Stagger power works. The bad news... well, the stance doesn't work right. Nonetheless, I can implement the rest of my designs. The skill, a fortifying drink, will be reminiscent of indignation and inner peace. Doing an action if you are in the stance, and entering that stance if you aren't. Because I'm boring, and the drunk stance theme is damage reduction, it will grant block if you're drunk and change stance to drunk if you aren't. This is done with a check to the player.stance.id and comparing it to our stance ID. The other option for skills that change stances were Crescendo and Tranquility, which retain and exhaust on use. Let's implement that as well to look at how to auto-retain cards. Come to think of it, we haven't actually made a self-exhausting card yet either. Well, referencing Crescendo's source code, all we need to do is set the card's exhaust field to true and the self-retain field to true. Finding a niche for a stance has actually been fairly difficult, so I haven't worried about applying it to my card designs. Taking a cue from the Marks mod mentioned earlier, however, I decided to make the attack scale based on current stagger and the enemy's mark. This involves searching through both the monsters and the player's powers, but it gives some reason for purposefully stacking higher stagger amounts and gives a use to an otherwise very niche effect. For the power, I was inspired by Like Water, to have an effect trigger based on the current stance. I originally set up a switch case statement, but this doesn't work for our stance ID construction, as this ends up decided during runtime instead of compile time. We could still do this for base game stances, but we don't gain much for readability, so I decided to use if-else statements instead. I'm going to take some time to work on bug fixing for the next update, as well as look into events to implement an idea I had nearly 2 years ago. I'm also going to go through my videos and make sure that the English closed captions are accurate. I wish you all a safe, yet spooky Halloween.